Chapter 1. Before Illinois was Illinois. Long before the first European explorers pushed their canoes up the Mississippi or cut their way through the dense woods of the Midwest, the land we now call Illinois was already ancient with stories. To imagine this world, one must strip away the cities, the farms, and the highways, and replace them with endless prairies swaying with tall grass as high as a man's shoulders. Forests dense with oak and hickory, rivers teeming with fish, and wetlands alive with migrating birds. It was a land shaped by glaciers thousands of years earlier, carved into rolling plains and fertile valleys. To the people who lived here, it was not wilderness, but home, a place where earth and sky and water were bound together in cycles of planting, hunting, feasting, and ceremony. The first humans to arrive in this region came at the end of the last ice age. Perhaps 12,000 years ago, when mammoths and mastodons still roamed the frozen plains. These early hunters left little behind but stone spear points and the faint traces of campsites. Over centuries, as the climate warmed and the giant animals vanished, communities adapted. They learned to fish the rivers, to gather nuts and berries, to hunt deer and turkey in the forests, and to cultivate the fertile soil. What emerged was not a wandering existence, but societies rooted in the land. Each generation adding to the layers of human memory that still linger beneath Illinois soil. The most striking evidence of this deep past lies in the great earthen mounds scattered across the Mississippi Valley, with none more famous than those at Cahokia, just across the river from today's St. Louis. Around the year 1000 CE, Cahokia rose as the largest city north of Mexico, a place of immense plazas, temples, and towering mounds built entirely by human hands with baskets of earth. At its peak, perhaps 20,000 people lived there, farmers, artisans, priests, and chiefs, making it larger than many European cities of the same era. From the top of Monk's Mound, a massive platform rising 10 stories high, rulers looked out over a bustling city of thatched houses, ceremonial grounds, and a wooden circle that served as a solar calendar. Cahokia was the center of the Mississippian world, an urban hub connected by rivers and trails to a continent-wide network of trade. Goods flowed in from every direction. Copper from the Great Lakes gleamed in ornaments. Shells from the Gulf Coast were carved into pendants. Obsidian and flint from the Rockies and the Ozarks were shaped into tools. The Mississippi River served as a superhighway, carrying canoes filled with corn, pottery, hides, and stone. The influence of Cahokia stretched across hundreds of miles, binding distant peoples together through exchange, ceremony, and shared symbols. For centuries, the city thrived, shaping the culture of the entire region. Yet Cahokia was not eternal. By the 1300s, the city began to decline. Environmental stress, deforestation, flooding, and internal conflict may all have played a part. As the great mounds fell silent, smaller villages dotted the landscape, and new tribal confederacies rose. But the memory of Cahokia lingered like a legend, carried in stories, artifacts, and the continued presence of mounds scattered across Illinois. Even as centuries passed, the land remained filled with meaning, each river, bend, and forest clearing connected to generations of ancestors. When Europeans first entered Illinois in the 17th century, they encountered the Illiniwek, or Illinois Confederation, a powerful alliance of tribes who gave the state its name. The Illiniwek were not a single people, but a group bound together by language and custom, including the Kaskaskia, Peoria, Cahokia, and Tamaroa. They lived in villages of longhouses and wigwams, planted fields of corn, beans, and squash, and hunted game across the prairies. The rivers remained their lifelines. The Illinois River, winding gracefully through the heart of the state, was both highway and pantry, a place where fish were plentiful and where dugout canoes carried traders and warriors alike. These societies were not isolated. Long before the French or the British arrived, the peoples of Illinois were deeply woven into the fabric of North America. Their warriors traveled to fight enemies on distant plains. Their traders exchanged goods with tribes stretching from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. Their rituals and dances echoed beliefs that tied human life to the movements of the sun and stars. Every season carried its rhythms: planting in the spring, harvest in the fall, hunts in the winter, and great gatherings where stories were told, marriages arranged, and alliances renewed. The land itself seemed to invite connection. The prairies stretched wide, but rivers cut easy paths east to the Great Lakes and west to the Mississippi. Anyone who controlled Illinois sat at the crossroads of a continent. This strategic position would later draw settlers, armies, and railroads. But even in the days before Europeans, it shaped the destiny of the people who called it home. Here was a land of abundance, yet also a land where power was always contested. Tribes shifted, wars flared, alliances rose and fell. Life was secure only as long as communities worked together, farming the soil and protecting their villages from rivals. To picture Illinois before Illinois is to see a place already old with human history, already shaped by ambition, faith, and survival. The story of the state begins not with treaties or battles written on parchment, but with the footprints of hunters tracking deer through snow, with women bending to plant seeds in dark earth, with children splashing in rivers, with priests lifting their hands toward the sky atop earthen mounds that still stand as silent witnesses. It begins with Cahokia's grandeur and decline, with the Illinois' strength and vulnerability, and with the endless pulse of trade and travel along the Mississippi Valley. This was a land alive with meaning long before it was ever called Illinois. And it was into this world, rich, complex, and fragile, that the first Europeans would step. Their arrival would transform everything. But to understand the Illinois that followed, one must first stand in awe of the Illinois that already was. Chapter 2: The French Frontier. When Europeans first entered the Illinois country, they stepped into a world already rich with history, yet entirely new to their eyes. The first recorded to venture into this land were the French, who had carved their way through the St. Lawrence Valley, across the Great Lakes, and down rivers that stretched into the unknown heart of North America. They came not as conquering armies, but as explorers, priests, and traders, driven by the promise of discovery, the thirst for souls to convert, and the lure of wealth that lay hidden in the forests and waters of the interior. In 1673, two men, Jacques Marquette, a Jesuit missionary, and Louis Joliet, a French-Canadian trader and explorer, set out from the mission at Saint-Ignace in present-day Michigan. Their goal was to chart the fabled Mississippi River, which they had heard about from native tribes. Some believed the great river might lead all the way to the Pacific and to China. Others thought it might empty into the Gulf of Mexico. Whatever the truth, France wanted to know. For knowledge meant power, and power meant the ability to outmaneuver Spain and England in the struggle for the New World. Guided by native allies, Marquette and Joliet paddled through the Fox River, portaged across marshy land, and at last entered the Wisconsin River. From there, the current carried them into the mighty Mississippi itself, the river that native peoples had revered and depended upon for countless generations. As they drifted southward, They marveled at the width and strength of the waters, the abundance of fish and game, and the fertile lands that stretched away into prairie and forest. In their journals, they recorded the villages of tribes they encountered: Mascoutins, Miami, and Illinois. People who greeted them with curiosity, suspicion, or generosity, depending on the moment. It was in Illinois country, near the mouth of the Illinois River, that Marquette and Joliet came face to face with the Illiniwek. The encounter was peaceful, and the explorers were welcomed into villages where feasts were held in their honor. Marquette, with his missionary zeal, preached to his hosts and marveled at the richness of their culture. He described the land as among the most fertile he had ever seen, with meadows stretching as far as the eye could reach, rivers full of fish, and woods alive with game. To him, Illinois seemed destined to become the jewel of New France. But Marquette and Joliet were not conquerors, and after traveling as far south as Arkansas, they turned back, convinced that the Mississippi did not lead to the Pacific, but flowed instead into the Gulf, where Spain's influence was strong. They returned to Canada with their reports. And though Joliet's maps were tragically lost in a canoe accident, Marquette's writings ensured that the Illinois country entered the European imagination. It was no longer an unknown land, but a place of promise, a frontier where faith, trade, and empire could take root. In the years that followed, other Frenchmen came. Traders known as voyageurs and coureurs de bois moved along the rivers, carrying European goods, knives, beads, kettles, guns, and exchanging them for furs, particularly beaver pelts, which were prized in Europe for hat making. The fur trade became the lifeblood of French Illinois, linking native hunters with French merchants and tying both into a global economy that stretched from the forests of the Midwest to the fashion houses of Paris. The Jesuits, too, pressed deeper, founding missions at Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and along the Illinois River. These missions sought to convert native peoples to Christianity, but they also served as centers of French influence, places where European ways mingled uneasily with native traditions. Priests baptized children, taught prayers, and tried to reshape customs. But they also learned native languages, shared food, and wrote accounts that remain some of our most vivid descriptions of life in 17th century Illinois. By the early 1700s, permanent French settlements had been established in the Mississippi Valley. Kaskaskia, founded in 1703, became the most important of these, a bustling village where French farmers grew wheat and corn, where traders met to barter, and where priests tended their flocks. Cahokia, across the river from present-day St. Louis, followed soon after, joined later by Fort de Chartres, which became the administrative and military center of French Illinois. These communities were small compared to European cities, but they were vibrant outposts of French culture in the wilderness, with wooden houses, small chapels, and fields carved out of the prairie. Life in these villages was not easy. Floods from the Mississippi could sweep away homes and crops, disease could strike without warning, and relations with neighboring tribes were always uncertain. Yet for many French settlers, Illinois offered opportunity. Land was plentiful, the soil was rich, and the rivers tied them to distant markets. Some intermarried with native women, creating families that bridged two worlds. The children of these unions carried both French and native traditions, and many grew up speaking multiple languages, a testament to the cultural mingling of the frontier. But the French did not live in isolation. Their presence shifted the balance of power among native peoples. The fur trade brought goods and wealth, but it also brought guns, alcohol, and new rivalries. Tribes allied with the French found themselves drawn into conflicts with tribes allied to the British, or with others who sought to control the trade routes. The Illiniwek, once powerful, began to decline under pressure from enemies like the Iroquois and Sioux, as well as from disease carried by Europeans. Their numbers dwindled and their villages scattered, even as French priests and officials tried to protect them. As decades passed, the Illinois country became a contested frontier, not just between tribes, but between empires. The British, pushing westward from their colonies on the Atlantic, sought to challenge French dominance of the interior. Skirmishes between British and French traders broke out. Alliances shifted, and the native peoples found themselves caught in the middle. By mid-century, tension between France and Britain erupted into the French and Indian War, part of the global struggle known as the 7 Years' War. Illinois, though far from the centers of battle in the East, was swept up in the conflict. French forts became targets, and native tribes weighed their options carefully. Some sided with the French, with whom they had long-standing ties, while others leaned toward the British, hoping to secure better terms or simply to survive. The war dragged on, and when it ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris, France ceded its claims east of the Mississippi to Britain. The dream of Illinois as a French province, part of New France stretching from Quebec to Louisiana, was shattered. For the French settlers who remained in Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and other villages, the change of rulers was bewildering. They had built their lives under French law and Catholic faith, and suddenly they found themselves subjects of a Protestant king an ocean away. Many chose to leave, crossing the river to settle in Spanish Louisiana rather than live under British rule. Others stayed, clinging to their language and customs, even as British soldiers marched into Fort de Chartres. The French frontier in Illinois had lasted less than a century, but its impact was profound. It had mapped the land, forged the first European settlements, and set patterns of trade and culture that would endure. The French brought with them not only their goods and faith, but their vision of Illinois as a place of abundance, a land worth holding and fighting for. They left behind villages that would grow into towns, traditions that would linger in names and churches, and a legacy that still echoes in the history of the state. And yet, as the French era ended, a new struggle began. The British, eager to extend their empire westward, now laid claim to Illinois. Native tribes, weary of broken promises and shrinking lands, bristled at the change. The Illinois country, once the domain of mounds and confederacies, once the dream of French priests and traders, was about to be drawn into the storm of empire, revolution, and the birth of a new nation. Chapter 3. From Colonies to Statehood. When the French frontier ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1763, Illinois slipped into a new era under British control. The French villages of Kaskaskia and Cahokia still echoed with the sound of church bells and French voices, but their allegiance now lay with a distant king in London. For the British, Illinois was less a prize than a burden, remote, hard to govern, and costly to defend. Yet, its fertile soil, its waterways, and its strategic position at the heart of the continent ensured that Illinois could not be ignored. What unfolded in the years after 1763 set the stage for Illinois' transformation from colonial outpost to American state. The British takeover brought unease to native peoples. For decades they had traded and fought alongside the French, and though not always allies, they had built relationships of trust, ceremony, and kinship. The British, by contrast, treated the Illinois country as conquered land. Their officers dismissed old alliances, restricted the flow of trade goods, and allowed settlers to push into territories long claimed by native tribes. Resentment boiled over into Pontiac's rebellion in 1763, when a coalition of tribes struck at British forts across the Midwest. Though the rebellion faltered, it left scars and deepened the sense among native peoples that their world was under siege. For the French inhabitants of Illinois, British rule was disorienting. Catholic priests found themselves watched with suspicion by Protestant governors, and French farmers felt little connection to London's officials. Many families crossed the Mississippi to join relatives in Spanish Louisiana rather than live under the new regime. Those who remained held tight to their traditions, making Illinois a cultural patchwork where French, native, and now British influences mixed uneasily. When the American Revolution erupted in 1775, Illinois seemed far removed from the battles at Lexington and Concord or the debates in Philadelphia. Yet the war's currents soon reached its prairies and rivers. The British saw Illinois as a base for coordinating alliances with native tribes against the rebellious colonies. From forts at Detroit and along the Mississippi, they armed warriors who struck American settlements in Kentucky and the Ohio Valley. To the struggling revolutionaries, the Illinois country became a dangerous frontier where British power threatened the very survival of the western frontier. Into this uncertain world stepped George Rogers Clark, a young Virginian with bold ideas and a relentless will. Clark believed that the key to securing the American frontier lay not just in defending Kentucky, but in seizing the Illinois country from the British. In 1778, with the blessing of Virginia's Governor Patrick Henry, Clark assembled a small force of frontiersmen, no more than 200 in all, and set out on what would become one of the most daring campaigns of the Revolution. Clark and his men marched across a rough country, navigating swamps, rivers, and thick forests, enduring hunger and exhaustion as they pressed westward. In July 1778, they descended upon Kaskaskia, the largest French village in Illinois. Expecting resistance, Clark instead found little opposition. The French inhabitants, weary of British indifference, welcomed him with cautious hope. He reassured them that their religion and property would be respected under American rule, and soon the tricolor of France gave way to the stars and stripes. Cahokia and other settlements followed, surrendering without bloodshed. Clark's greatest test came the following winter at Vincennes, a post on the Wabash River in present-day Indiana. Though not in Illinois proper, its fate would determine control of the region. The British commander, Henry Hamilton, nicknamed the Hair Buyer for allegedly paying for American scalps, had retaken Vincennes in late 1778. Clark, undeterred, led his ragged band on a grueling midwinter march across flooded plains, wading for days through waist-deep, icy water. Starving and exhausted, his men reached Vincennes in February 1779 and launched a surprise assault. After days of fighting and intimidation, Hamilton surrendered. The victory gave the Americans a firm hold on the Illinois country and bolstered their claim to the Trans-Appalachian West when peace negotiations finally began. Though Clark's forces were small, the symbolic weight of his campaign was enormous. It demonstrated that the Revolution was not confined to the eastern seaboard, but stretched deep into the heart of the continent. When the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, ending the war, Britain ceded to the United States not only its 13 colonies, but also the vast lands between the Appalachians and the Mississippi. including Illinois. The Illinois country, once French, then British, now lay within the young American Republic. Yet the question remained, what would the new nation do with this vast territory? The land was home to native tribes, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Sauk, Fox, and others, who had not been consulted in the treaty and had no intention of surrendering their homelands. It was also home to scattered French communities, who now had to adjust once more to a new regime, this time under an untested republic. The answer emerged in the form of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, one of the most important documents in American history. The Northwest Ordinance established the framework for governing the territory north of the Ohio River, including Illinois. It declared that the land would not be colonies to be exploited, but territories on a path to eventual statehood. Once a territory reached a population of 60,000 free inhabitants, it could apply to join the Union as an equal state. The ordinance guaranteed freedom of religion, trial by jury, and the prohibition of cruel punishment. Most significantly, it banned slavery north of the Ohio River, setting a precedent that would shape the sectional struggles of the 19th century. For Illinois, the Northwest Ordinance was both a promise and a challenge. The promise was clear. This fertile land would one day stand alongside Virginia and Massachusetts as an equal member of the Union. But the challenge lay in the reality on the ground. Native tribes resisted American settlement, launching raids and defending their villages against encroachment. The federal government struggled to assert authority so far from the centers of power. Settlers trickled in from Kentucky and Virginia, bringing with them not only plows and rifles, but also slaves, testing the ordinance's ban and setting the stage for future conflicts. Throughout the 1790s and early 1800s, the Illinois country remained a contested frontier. Native confederacies, led by figures like Tecumseh, fought desperately to hold back the tide of American expansion. Battles raged in the Ohio Valley, and though Illinois was often on the fringes of these conflicts, its prairies and rivers were never far from danger. Treaties, often coerced, chipped away at native claims, and by the early 19th century, large tracts of Illinois were open to settlement. Kaskaskia emerged as the territorial capital, a symbol of continuity from French days to the American present. Farmers arrived to till the rich soil, hunters roamed the woods, and towns grew along the rivers. The Mississippi and Illinois rivers became vital arteries of commerce, carrying goods south to New Orleans and north to the Great Lakes. With every passing year, the population swelled, though it remained a frontier society, rough and uncertain, marked by log cabins, small farms, and isolated villages. By 1810, Illinois had grown from a scattered cluster of French villages into a recognizable territory of the United States. The War of 1812 brought new turmoil, as British forces and their native allies struck American settlements in the Midwest. Illinois was not spared. Raids and skirmishes unsettled its frontier, and settlers huddled in forts for protection. Yet the war's end only accelerated American dominance. Native resistance was broken, British influence waned, and Illinois was firmly on the path to statehood. In 1818, the long journey reached its culmination. Congress approved Illinois' admission as the 21st state of the Union. Its boundaries were drawn generously, stretching north to include land that would one day host Chicago. A choice that ensured Illinois would not be a small frontier backwater, but a future giant of commerce. Kaskaskia, the old French village by the Mississippi, became the first state capital. On December 3, 1818, Illinois joined the United States, its flag added to the growing constellation of stars. For the people of Illinois, statehood was both triumph and beginning. The French settlers saw their villages enshrined in American law. The American pioneers saw their farms recognized by state authority, and native peoples, though increasingly dispossessed, still held to their lands in the face of mounting pressure. The new state embodied contradictions: free soil in law but not always in practice, frontier hardship alongside soaring dreams, a land of opportunity built atop layers of displacement and struggle. The Illinois that entered the Union in 1818 was not yet the Illinois of railroads, factories, and booming cities. It was still a land of small farms and scattered towns, of rivers more traveled than roads, of memory still fresh with French, British, and native legacies. Yet its admission marked a turning point. From colonies to territory to statehood, Illinois had become part of the American experiment, and its story was now inseparable from the nation's. Chapter 4: Prairie Dreams and Frontier Life. When Illinois entered the Union in 1818, it was still a raw frontier, a place where the promise of fertile land and new opportunity drew men and women westward from the crowded states along the Atlantic seaboard. What they found was a landscape unlike anything many had ever seen. The great Illinois prairie stretched in every direction, an ocean of grass, tall as a rider's shoulders in summer, dotted with wildflowers and cut by winding rivers and streams. To settlers accustomed to the forests of Kentucky, Virginia, or Pennsylvania, the openness of the prairie was both a marvel and a challenge. It offered soil of unmatched richness, black loam that seemed to promise endless harvests. But it also presented obstacles. No trees for building, no shade in the blistering summers, and endless labor to break the thick sod that had lain undisturbed for centuries. Settlers came in steady waves, first trickling across the Ohio River and up from Kentucky, then flowing in larger numbers as word of Illinois' fertility spread. They traveled by wagon, on horseback, or even on foot, carrying with them little more than tools, seeds, and determination. Many built log cabins at the edge of forests, clinging to the familiar woods for shelter and firewood before daring to move out onto the open prairie. Slowly, the tall grass gave way to farms. Small fields of corn and wheat, vegetable gardens, orchards, and pastures where cattle and hogs grazed. It was backbreaking work, but the promise of ownership drew them onward. In Illinois, land was cheap, sometimes as little as $1.25 per acre, a fraction of what it cost in the East. For poor farmers and ambitious families, it was a chance to carve a future with their own hands. Life on the prairie was marked by hardship as much as by opportunity. Winters could be brutal, with icy winds sweeping across the open land, piling snow against cabins and freezing streams solid. Summers brought swarms of mosquitoes, prairie fires that could sweep with terrifying speed, and the constant toil of farming from dawn to dusk. Neighbors were few, and isolation weighed heavily on families. A trip to the nearest settlement for supplies or mail might take days. Yet, out of this isolation grew a fierce independence, a belief that survival depended on resourcefulness and community. When barns needed raising or fields needed harvesting, neighbors gathered and the work was done together. Churches and schools sprang up, often little more than one-room log buildings. But they bound scattered families into communities, giving the prairie not just farms, but villages and towns. Even as pioneers pushed forward, they clashed with older traditions that still lingered in Illinois. The French villages along the Mississippi retained their distinct character. Catholic churches, narrow fields called long lots, stretching back from the river, and customs carried on since the 17th century. To the Americans pouring in from Kentucky, Ohio, and New England, these French communities seemed relics of another age. Yet for decades they coexisted uneasily, sometimes trading and mingling, sometimes keeping to themselves. The frontier was not just about new land. It was about the collision of cultures, of old ways yielding reluctantly to the rising tide of American settlement. The presence of native peoples added another layer to frontier life. Tribes such as the Potawatomi, Kickapoos, and Sauk still lived in Illinois, hunting, farming, and moving along their ancestral trails. For a time, settlers and tribes traded and tolerated one another. But as the flow of settlers swelled, tensions sharpened. Land treaties, often signed under pressure, stripped native peoples of their territory, forcing them westward. Raids and skirmishes flared, feeding fear and resentment. For settlers, the prairie was a land to be tamed. For native tribes, it was a home slipping away. The clash was inevitable, and the balance of power tipped steadily toward the newcomers. As towns grew, Illinois' identity began to take shape. One such town was Springfield, a modest settlement along the Sangamon River. At first, it was little more than a cluster of cabins and stores, founded in the 1820s by pioneers drawn by the fertile land and good water supply. It lacked the grandeur of Kaskaskia or the deep history of Cahokia. But Springfield had something more important. Location. Situated at the crossroads of trails and near fertile farmland, it quickly became a hub for trade and politics. Farmers brought their grain and livestock to market. Merchants sold tools and cloth, and courts convened to settle disputes. What began as a small frontier town would, within a few decades, become the beating heart of Illinois. Into this world of prairie farms and rising towns stepped a young man who would one day shape not only Illinois, but the nation itself. Abraham Lincoln arrived in Illinois in 1830 with his family, poor and seeking opportunity like so many others. They settled near Decatur, where the 19-year-old Lincoln helped his father build a cabin and clear land for crops. He split rails, worked odd jobs, and grew tall and strong in the hard labor of frontier life. The prairie tested him as it tested everyone, but it also offered chances for growth. Unlike in the rigid hierarchies of the East, a young man in Illinois could make his way through determination, skill, and character. Lincoln moved often in those early years, working as a ferryman, store clerk, and surveyor. By 1831, he had made his way to New Salem, a small village along the Sangamon. There he gained a reputation for his strength, honesty, and humor. He wrestled the local bully, helped neighbors with chores, and spent long nights reading borrowed books by the light of the fire. For Lincoln, Illinois was both a home and a proving ground. The frontier demanded practical skills, but it also rewarded ambition. His quick mind and plain-spoken manner won him friends and respect, and soon he was drawn into local politics, serving in the militia during the Black Hawk War and later running for the state legislature. The rise of Springfield and the rise of Lincoln became intertwined. By the 1830s, Springfield had grown enough to attract lawyers, merchants, and politicians. Its central location in the state made it a natural gathering place for political conventions and legislative sessions. Lincoln, by then a young lawyer, moved to Springfield in 1837, beginning a career that would carry him from dusty courtrooms to the White House. In those early years, however, he was still just one of many men trying to build a life on the Illinois frontier. arguing cases, debating issues, and walking the streets of a town still small enough that everyone knew one another. The story of Illinois in these decades was not just one of individual ambition, but of rapid transformation. In less than a generation, the state shifted from frontier wilderness to a society in motion. Roads were cut across the prairie, towns sprouted along rivers and trails, and agriculture expanded in scale and ambition. Wheat and corn poured out of Illinois, feeding distant markets. Livestock moved along drovers' roads, and steamboats carried goods down the Mississippi. The frontier way of life, log cabins, hand-plowed fields, barter with neighbors, was giving way to something more modern, more connected, more restless. Yet the old and the new overlapped constantly. In some parts of Illinois, settlers still hunted deer in the forests, fished rivers with simple nets, and gathered for barn dances in the tradition of their parents. In others, towns boasted brick buildings, newspapers, and theaters, symbols of sophistication. The prairie was vast enough to hold both, and the clash between tradition and change gave Illinois its unique character. It was a place where one could still see ox-drawn wagons creaking across the fields even as political debates echoed in Springfield's halls, where a boy might split rails for his father in the morning and study law in the evening. The dreams of the prairie were as wide as the land itself. For some, Illinois was a chance at simple independence, a farm and a family sustained by the soil. For others, it was a platform for ambition, a stage on which to rise in business, law, or politics. What united them was the belief that this land offered possibility, that here, more than in the crowded East, a person could shape his or her destiny. But those dreams were never free of conflict. Native tribes were being driven out, old cultures were fading, and the hardships of prairie life claimed many who could not endure. Still, the momentum of settlement was unstoppable, carrying Illinois from wilderness to community, from isolation to growth. As Springfield rose and Lincoln's early years unfolded, Illinois itself grew into adolescence. The struggles of the frontier were not behind it, but the state was no longer just cabins scattered across the tall grass. It was becoming a society with laws, institutions, and a voice in the nation. The prairie, once feared for its vastness, was now prized for its bounty, and the dreams it inspired were already shaping the future. Illinois was moving swiftly toward the stage of history, and the young lawyer in Springfield was destined to become its most famous son. Chapter 5. Slavery, Freedom, and the Great Debate. Illinois entered the Union in 1818 as a free state under the terms of the Northwest Ordinance, but freedom in law did not always mean freedom in practice. From the very beginning, Illinois carried a contradiction at its core. Officially free soil, yet deeply entangled with slavery through custom, economy, and politics. This tension would define much of the state's early history and eventually catapult one of its most determined citizens onto the national stage. The contradiction began with the French. Before the American Revolution, French settlers in Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and along the Mississippi held African slaves to work their fields and households. When the United States took control after 1783, the Northwest Ordinance banned slavery in the region, but existing French slaveholders were allowed to keep their enslaved people. Thus, even as Illinois claimed the mantle of freedom, slavery remained embedded in pockets of its society. Later arrivals from Kentucky and other slave states brought with them enslaved laborers under legal loopholes called indentures. These contracts, sometimes lasting decades, were slavery by another name, and for many years they kept Illinois hovering uneasily between freedom and bondage. Politics reflected this divided reality. In 1824, only 6 years after statehood, Illinois held a referendum on whether to call a constitutional convention to legalize slavery outright. The measure was fiercely debated across the state. Pro-slavery advocates argued that the rich farmland could never be fully developed without enslaved labor. They pointed to Kentucky and Missouri, where plantation agriculture flourished, and claimed Illinois would remain poor and backward if it did not follow suit. Opponents countered that slavery was both a moral evil and a threat to the independence of small farmers who had come to Illinois seeking free land and self-reliance. The campaign turned bitter, with newspapers, pamphlets, and fiery speeches on both sides. When the votes were counted, the pro-slavery cause was defeated, largely thanks to strong opposition in northern Illinois, where settlers from New England brought their anti-slavery convictions. The defeat of the convention secured Illinois's identity as a free state. But the close nature of the fight revealed just how divided the state remained. Slavery was not gone. It lingered in indentured servitude and in the political imagination, casting a long shadow over the decades to come. As the 19th century advanced, Illinois became both a border and a crossroads in America's struggle over slavery. Just across the Mississippi River lay Missouri, admitted to the Union as a slave state in 1821. Kentucky, too, allowed slavery, and enslaved men and women sometimes crossed the river into Illinois seeking freedom. This geography made Illinois a key battleground for the Underground Railroad, the loose network of routes, safe houses, and allies that helped fugitives escape to the north. The Underground Railroad in Illinois was not a single road, but a web of paths that stretched from the Ohio River in the south up through central Illinois and into Chicago, where fugitives could continue on to freedom in Canada. Abolitionists, free black families, and sympathetic whites risked fines and imprisonment to shelter and guide runaways. In towns like Alton, Quincy, and Springfield, secret cellars and barns became refugees. Churches served as meeting points, and wagons carried hidden passengers under blankets of hay or sacks of grain. The dangers were real. The federal Fugitive Slave Acts required that escaped slaves be returned to their owners, and slave catchers often prowled Illinois towns searching for fugitives. Violence sometimes erupted, as in the case of Elijah Lovejoy, a Presbyterian minister and newspaper editor in Alton. Lovejoy spoke out boldly against slavery, denouncing it as a sin and calling for immediate abolition. His printing presses were destroyed multiple times by pro-slavery mobs. In 1837, a mob attacked his warehouse, and Lovejoy was killed defending his press. His death sent shockwaves across Illinois and the nation, turning him into a martyr for the cause of free speech and abolition. Illinois thus stood at a crossroads, not only geographically between North and South, but morally between the principles of liberty and the compromises of slavery. In this crucible, a lanky lawyer from Springfield began to shape his political career. Abraham Lincoln had arrived in the state as a poor farm boy, worked his way into law and politics, and by the 1830s was serving in the Illinois legislature. At first, Lincoln's stance on slavery was cautious. Like many in Illinois, he was no radical abolitionist. He accepted that slavery existed in the South where it was protected by law, but he opposed its expansion into new territories. To him, slavery was wrong, but it was also a reality that had to be dealt with within the framework of the Constitution. Lincoln's pragmatism reflected Illinois itself. The state was divided. Northern counties leaned toward anti-slavery, with settlers from New England and the Great Lakes. Southern counties, known as Egypt, were filled with migrants from Kentucky and Tennessee, many of whom brought Southern attitudes about race and slavery. For a politician to succeed in Illinois, he had to navigate these currents carefully. Lincoln, with his plain speech and logical arguments, became adept at doing so. By the 1850s, however, the national debate over slavery was intensifying, and Illinois found itself thrust to the center of the storm. The passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 reopened the question of whether slavery could expand into new territories, overturning the Missouri Compromise that had long tried to balance free and slave states. The act outraged many in Illinois, and Lincoln was among them. Though he had stepped away from politics for several years to focus on his law practice, the Kansas-Nebraska Act drew him back with renewed vigor. He argued that allowing slavery to spread violated the nation's founding principle that all men are created equal. It was in this charged atmosphere that Lincoln's path crossed with that of Stephen A. Douglas, Illinois' most powerful politician. Douglas, a brilliant orator and U.S. Senator, was the architect of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. He championed popular sovereignty, the idea that each territory should decide for itself whether to allow slavery. To Douglas, this was a compromise that respected local control. To Lincoln, it was a dangerous surrender to the spread of a moral wrong. The clash between Lincoln and Douglas came to a head in 1858, when Lincoln ran against Douglas for the U.S. Senate. What followed became one of the most famous series of debates in American history. Across 7 towns in Illinois, from Ottawa to Freeport, Galesburg to Alton, the two men faced each other before crowds that sometimes numbered in the thousands. Farmers left their fields, merchants closed their shops, and families traveled miles to hear the arguments. The debates were not the sound bites of modern politics, but hours-long speeches followed by rebuttals, a test of stamina as well as intellect. Douglas, short and forceful, argued that the people of each territory should decide the slavery question for themselves, free from interference. He painted Lincoln as a radical abolitionist who would tear the Union apart. Lincoln, tall and deliberate, countered that while he did not seek to abolish slavery where it already existed, he could not accept its expansion. He framed the debate in moral terms, declaring that the nation could not endure half slave and half free. His words gave voice to the unease of many who feared that slavery's spread would corrupt the nation's ideals. At Freeport, Douglas advanced what became known as the Freeport Doctrine, insisting that local laws could effectively bar slavery even if the Supreme Court had ruled otherwise in the Dred Scott decision. The argument helped him keep his Senate seat, as Illinois voters narrowly returned him to Washington. Lincoln lost the election, but he won something more important: national attention. Newspapers across the country reprinted his speeches, and his moral clarity impressed audiences far beyond Illinois. For Illinois, the debates were a moment of self-definition. The prairie towns where Lincoln and Douglas sparred became stages on which the nation's greatest conflict was acted out in miniature. Ordinary Illinoisans, gathered in public squares, listened as two of their own wrestled with the question that threatened to tear the Union apart. The debates crystallized the state's role as both a mirror and a mediator of the national struggle over slavery. The tension between slavery and freedom had shaped Illinois from its earliest days. From the French indentures in Kaskaskia to the abolitionist presses in Alton, By the 1850s, that tension had become inseparable from the state's politics and identity. It was no longer enough to straddle the line between North and South. Illinois, through Lincoln, had begun to take a stand. The seeds planted in those prairie debates would soon grow into a presidency and a war that would decide the nation's fate. Chapter 6. Illinois in the Civil War. When Abraham Lincoln left Springfield in February 1861 to take up the presidency, he departed as a familiar neighbor and returned in the imagination of Illinoisans as the leader of a nation about to split apart. His farewell to Springfield, delivered from the platform of a train, was heartfelt and simple, acknowledging the weight of what lay before him. "Here I have lived a quarter of a century," he told the friends and townsfolk who gathered to see him off. "To this people I owe all that I am." His words captured the bond between Illinois and the man who would now bear the burden of preserving the Union. Within weeks, as the cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter, that burden extended to his home state. Illinois, with its deep ties to both North and South, would become a crucial player in the great conflict that followed. Illinois was not a slave state, but its location on the Mississippi River and its long border with Kentucky and Missouri gave it an intimate connection to the South. Families in southern Illinois, known as Little Egypt, often had relatives across the river and sympathies that leaned toward the Confederacy. In northern Illinois, by contrast, settlers from New England and the Midwest tended to support abolition and the Union cause with fervor. When war came, the state's divisions did not vanish, but they were overcome by an overwhelming outpouring of support for Lincoln and the Union. In 1861, Governor Richard Yates responded to the president's call for volunteers by raising more regiments than Washington had asked for. Men flocked to enlist, streaming into hastily constructed camps around Springfield, Chicago, and Alton, drilling with borrowed muskets and waiting for uniforms that sometimes lagged weeks behind their arrival. Over the course of the war, nearly 250,000 Illinois men would serve in the Union Army, a staggering number for a state that had just over 1.7 million people at the start of the conflict. They fought in almost every major campaign, from the battles along the Mississippi to the blood-soaked fields of Gettysburg. Illinois regiments earned reputations for toughness and endurance. Their flags carried proudly in the Western Theater, where so much of the Union's fate was decided. Among these men were farmers who left behind spring planting, clerks from Chicago's bustling streets, and boys barely old enough to shave, all united under the Stars and Stripes. Illinois also produced generals who would shape the course of the war. Chief among them was Ulysses S. Grant, a quiet, determined man who had lived in Galena, Illinois, working in his family's leather goods store when the war began. Grant's rise was meteoric. Appointed to lead regiments from Illinois, he quickly demonstrated a talent for command, winning early victories at Fort Donelson and Shiloh. His relentless drive and willingness to press forward when others hesitated earned him Lincoln's trust. In Grant, Lincoln saw a general who would fight and keep fighting. And from Illinois soil had emerged the man who would eventually command all Union armies and force the Confederacy's surrender. Other Illinois generals also left their mark. John A. Logan, from Southern Illinois, transformed from a Democratic politician with Southern sympathies into a fierce Union commander, leading troops with distinction and later helping to establish Memorial Day as a national tradition. General Benjamin Grierson, a music teacher turned cavalry officer from Jacksonville, led a daring raid through Mississippi that crippled Confederate supply lines and paved the way for Grant's victory at Vicksburg. These men, and many others, demonstrated that Illinois did not just send soldiers. It produced leaders who would help decide the outcome of the war. While its soldiers fought across the continent, Illinois itself became a hive of activity. Its economy and infrastructure mobilized for war. Railroads, which had spread rapidly across the state in the 1850s, now became lifelines of the Union Army. Lines radiating from Chicago carried troops and supplies southward, connecting to the Mississippi River and the battlefronts beyond. The efficiency of Illinois railroads allowed Lincoln and his generals to move men and materiel faster than the Confederacy could, giving the Union a decisive logistical edge. Towns that had once been sleepy junctions were suddenly transformed into bustling depots where soldiers boarded trains and carloads of food, ammunition, and uniforms rolled past. Industry, too, played its part. Chicago, already a rising city before the war, became an industrial powerhouse, its factories producing weapons, rail cars, uniforms, and boots for the Union Army. The stockyards supplied meat on a scale that astonished even seasoned quartermasters. Farmers across the state poured their harvests into the war effort, shipping grain, pork, and beef to feed armies in the field. The bounty of Illinois' soil was turned into strength for the Union cause, a reminder that wars are won not only on battlefields, but also in the fields and workshops that sustain the fighters. The home front carried burdens of its own. Women took on new responsibilities, managing farms and businesses in the absence of husbands and sons. They organized aid societies, sewing uniforms, knitting socks, and collecting bandages for wounded soldiers. Churches and community halls became centers for these efforts, and fairs raised money to support hospitals and relief for soldiers' families. In cities like Chicago, volunteer nurses tended to the sick and injured, their compassion easing the horrors of war. The war transformed not just the battlefield, but the fabric of daily life in Illinois, expanding the roles of women and strengthening communities through shared sacrifice. Yet Illinois was not free of strife. Political divisions simmered throughout the war, particularly in the southern counties. Some residents, known as Copperheads, opposed the war, criticized Lincoln's policies, and even advocated peace with the Confederacy. Newspapers carried heated debates, and in some towns, tensions between Unionists and anti-war Democrats erupted into violence. Lincoln himself, though revered by many, was also criticized harshly within his own state, accused of overreach or betrayal depending on the critic's perspective. The war tested not only the nation's unity, but Illinois' as well, forcing its people to confront their deepest divisions while still contributing to the larger cause. Illinois also bore witness to the darker sides of war. Prison camps were established within its borders, most notably at Rock Island on the Mississippi River, where thousands of Confederate prisoners were confined. Conditions were harsh, with disease and exposure taking many lives. The sight of captured rebels so far north brought the reality of war home to Illinoisans, reminding them that the conflict was not distant but immediate, its costs visible in their own communities. Despite these tensions and hardships, Illinois' commitment to the Union never faltered. Its soldiers returned home with stories of courage and sacrifice, some missing limbs, others bearing scars, seen and unseen. Memorials were built in courthouse squares, names of the fallen etched into stone to remind future generations of the price paid. The war left few families untouched, and its memory became woven into the state's identity. For Lincoln, Illinois remained a source of strength even as he governed from Washington. Letters from old friends in Springfield reached him, reminding him of the simple people whose hopes he carried. Illinois newspapers debated his policies, sometimes with praise, often with criticism. but always with the knowledge that he was their own. When he delivered the Gettysburg Address in 1863, its words resonated deeply with Illinoisans who had sent their sons to that bloody field. They knew the cost of preserving the Union, and they felt the weight of his promise that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. By 1865, when the war finally ended, Illinois had given more than most states. Nearly 250,000 of its men had served. Tens of thousands had died or been wounded. Its railroads, farms, and factories had kept the Union supplied. Its generals had led armies to victory. And from its prairie town of Springfield had come the president who, through triumph and tragedy, had guided the nation through its greatest trial. The war had transformed Illinois from a frontier state into a central pillar of the Union. Its role undeniable, and its sacrifices immense. The final tragedy struck in April 1865, when Lincoln was assassinated in Washington. His body was carried by train back to Springfield, retracing in reverse the journey he had made 4 years earlier. Along the route, crowds gathered to pay their respects, lining the tracks, weeping and laying flowers. In Springfield, tens of thousands came to see him laid to rest in Oak Ridge Cemetery. The man who had left as a neighbor returned as a martyr, his life and death forever binding Illinois to the story of the Union's survival. The Civil War marked a turning point for Illinois. No longer just a young state on the western frontier, it had proven itself essential to the preservation of the nation. Its soldiers, leaders, and citizens had shaped the outcome of the war, and its memory of sacrifice would echo for generations. From the prairies to the railroads, from the factories of Chicago to the small farms scattered across the land, Illinois had risen to the challenge of war. And as the smoke of battle cleared, the state faced a new question: how to rebuild, how to grow, and how to define its place in the America that had been preserved through so much blood and resolve. Chapter 7: Boomtowns and the Age of Industry. The Civil War had ended with Illinois deeply etched into the story of the Union, but as the nation turned from battlefields to building, it was not the farms or the prairies that defined the next chapter of the state's history. It was the city rising on the shore of Lake Michigan, a city that in a few short decades would grow from a muddy outpost into a metropolis of national importance. Chicago's rise was not slow and steady. It was meteoric, a transformation so rapid and so improbable that visitors often described it with awe, as if something unnatural had occurred on the Midwestern plain. The seeds of this transformation had been planted before the Civil War. The Illinois and Michigan Canal, completed in 1848, carved a watery path from the Chicago River to the Illinois River and through it to the Mississippi. With the canal, Chicago was no longer just a Great Lakes port. It was a link between two vast watersheds, connecting the interior of North America to the markets of the world. Grain, lumber, and livestock poured through the canal, filling warehouses and loading docks, and Chicago became the exchange point where the resources of the prairie met the demands of distant cities. The canal alone might have made Chicago a thriving town, but it was the railroads that transformed it into the beating heart of the Midwest. By the 1850s, steel rails spread out from Chicago in every direction, more spokes than any other city in America. Eastward lines ran to New York and Boston, westward to the Plains, southward to St. Louis and New Orleans, northward to Milwaukee and Minneapolis. By the end of the century, nearly every train that crossed the Midwest passed through Chicago. grain from Kansas, hogs from Iowa, lumber from Wisconsin. All of it came to Chicago to be bought, sold, processed, and shipped again. The city became a market in itself, a place where fortunes could be made not from farming or logging, but from trading paper contracts on what those farms and forests produced. As the railroads fed the city, Chicago swelled. Immigrants arrived by the thousands, many of them Germans and Irish in the mid-19th century, followed by Poles, Bohemians, Swedes, and later Italians, Lithuanians, and Jews from Eastern Europe. They came seeking work and found it in abundance. In the stockyards, where cattle and hogs were slaughtered and processed in staggering numbers. In the lumber yards, where entire forests from Wisconsin and Michigan were piled into endless stacks of boards. In factories that produced farm equipment, furniture, and clothing. In the rail yards, where switching crews worked day and night to keep goods moving. Chicago's population, just 30,000 in 1850, exploded to nearly 300,000 by 1870. And within a few decades, it would reach over 1 million. The scale of Chicago's growth was breathtaking. But it came with dangers. The city was built quickly and often cheaply. Wooden buildings, wooden sidewalks, even wooden streets filled block after block. Smoke from factories and homes choked the air, while sewage and animal waste fouled the river. Fire was a constant fear, and in October 1871, that fear became reality. On the evening of October 8th, a blaze broke out on the city's west side. The cause has never been definitively proven. Popular legend blamed a cow kicking over a lantern in a barn. But whatever the spark, the conditions were ripe for catastrophe. A dry summer had left the city parched, and high winds fanned the flames into an inferno. For 2 days, fire raged through Chicago. Whole neighborhoods were consumed, churches and schools reduced to ash, warehouses and shops gutted. Families fled with what they could carry, streams of refugees filling the streets as walls collapsed and sparks rained down. By the time the fire burned itself out, roughly a third of the city lay in ruins. More than 17,000 buildings destroyed, 100,000 people left homeless, and an estimated 300 dead. The skyline that had so recently symbolized Chicago's ambition was a smoking wasteland. Yet from the ashes of the fire came perhaps the most remarkable part of Chicago's story: its rebuilding. The city did not languish in despair. Within days, relief poured in from across the nation and beyond. Food, clothing, money, even prefabricated houses. The people of Chicago, hardened by years of growth and accustomed to relentless work, seized the opportunity not just to rebuild, but to reinvent their city. Wooden construction gave way to brick and stone. Architects experimented with steel frames and new designs, laying the groundwork for the skyscraper. Streets were widened, sewers improved, and parks planned. By 1873, just 2 years after the fire, the city hosted a national fair that showcased its recovery. Visitors marveled not at ruins, but at progress, at a city determined to rise bigger, stronger, and faster than before. The fire, in a strange way, accelerated Chicago's destiny. It became a laboratory for modern architecture and urban planning. The rebuilding drew some of the nation's brightest engineers and architects, who experimented with iron, glass, and steel in ways that would change city skylines forever. By the 1880s, Chicago was a city of ambition. Its downtown filled with buildings taller and more daring than any in the world. Its industries humming, its population swelling with new arrivals. But alongside prosperity came tension. The immigrants who fueled Chicago's factories and stockyards often worked in brutal conditions. Long hours, dangerous machines, low pay, and little protection. Tenements crowded with families sprang up in the working-class neighborhoods, their air thick with smoke and their water often unsafe to drink. Disease spread easily, and poverty weighed heavily. For the city's elite, the merchants, railroad barons, and meatpacking magnates, Chicago was a place of boundless opportunity. For many of its workers, it was a place of endless struggle. These conditions bred discontent, and Chicago became a center of labor agitation in the Gilded Age. Workers organized unions, demanded shorter hours, safer conditions, and better wages. Strikes erupted with increasing frequency, sometimes turning violent. The most infamous of these came in 1886, when a rally for the 8-hour workday in Haymarket Square ended in tragedy. A bomb exploded as police attempted to disperse the crowd, killing officers and civilians alike. Panic and fear gripped the city. Authorities arrested labor leaders, and in a highly controversial trial, several were executed despite flimsy evidence. The Haymarket affair became a symbol of repression to some, of anarchy to others, but above all of the growing divide between labor and capital in America's booming industrial cities. Chicago's labor struggles reflected broader tensions in Illinois and the nation during the Gilded Age. The rapid pace of industrialization created vast wealth, but also deep inequality. Railroads and factories brought efficiency and profit, but demanded sacrifices from the workers who kept them running. Immigrants, essential to the city's growth, were often scapegoated for unrest, their languages and customs viewed with suspicion by older residents. Politicians, caught between powerful business interests and restive workers, struggled to maintain order without stifling progress. Yet for all its turmoil, Chicago's rise could not be slowed. The stockyards expanded into an empire of meatpacking, described vividly in later years by Upton Sinclair, where animals by the thousands were slaughtered, processed, and shipped daily. The grain elevators along the river stood like monuments to commerce, storing the harvests of the prairie until they could be loaded onto ships and trains. The Board of Trade became a temple of speculation, where fortunes shifted with the swing of a price. Chicago was no longer just a city of the Midwest. It was a city of the world, tied by rail, river, and telegraph to markets across continents. The city's growth reshaped Illinois as a whole. Towns like Peoria, Rockford, and Aurora thrived on industry and rail connections. But Chicago dwarfed them all. Its population drew not only immigrants from Europe, but migrants from across the United States, including freedmen from the South seeking opportunity after the Civil War. The cultural mix created neighborhoods that were worlds unto themselves. German beer halls, Polish churches, Italian markets, Jewish synagogues. Each community added to the city's mosaic, but each also struggled with poverty, discrimination, and the challenges of assimilation. By the end of the 19th century, Illinois was no longer defined primarily by its fields and farms, though agriculture remained vital. It was defined by its booming industrial cities, above all by Chicago, which stood as a symbol of both the promise and peril of America's new age. It was a place where railroads converged, fortunes were made, and laborers risked their lives in pursuit of a better one. It was a city that had burned to the ground and risen again. A city that embodied resilience, ambition, and conflict. The Prairie State had entered the Gilded Age with a metropolis that seemed almost mythical in its speed and scale of growth. Chicago's story was Illinois' story, restless, ambitious, scarred by struggle. yet always reaching higher. And as the century turned, Illinois would find itself thrust once more onto the world stage, its city hosting a celebration that would define modern America and showcase to the globe just how far it had come. Chapter 8. World's Fair and World Stage. By the final decade of the 19th century, Chicago had transformed itself from a smoldering ruin into one of the most dynamic cities on the planet. Less than 20 years after the Great Fire of 1871, it had rebuilt not only its skyline, but its reputation, emerging as the second largest city in the United States. The world had taken notice. In the eyes of its boosters, Chicago was no longer merely the heart of the Midwest. It was a city that could rival New York, Paris, or London. And in 1893, Chicago set out to prove it with a spectacle so grand, so dazzling, that it would leave no doubt about its place on the world stage. The world's Columbian Exposition, often called the Chicago World's Fair, was conceived to commemorate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the Americas. After a fierce battle with New York, Chicago won the right to host the fair. To many, this decision symbolized the shift of American energy from the old cities of the East to the bold, ambitious frontier city on Lake Michigan. Chicago was determined not just to host the fair, but to astonish the world. The scale of the undertaking was staggering. The site chosen was Jackson Park, a stretch of land along the lakefront on the city's south side. There, under the direction of architect Daniel Burnham and landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, a city within a city rose. It became known as the White City, a breathtaking collection of gleaming neoclassical buildings faced with white plaster, their grand facades reflected in lagoons and canals. The fairgrounds covered more than 600 acres and included over 200 buildings, along with boulevards, fountains, gardens, and exhibits that stretched as far as the eye could see. When the gates opened in May 1893, visitors from across the globe streamed into Chicago. They came by rail, by steamship, and by carriage, filling hotels and boarding houses, crowding the streets and sidewalks. By the time the fair closed 6 months later, more than 27 million people had attended, nearly half the population of the United States at the time. For those who walked through its gates, the world's Columbian Exposition was like stepping into the future. The fair showcased the best of modern America. Electricity, still a novelty for many, illuminated the White City with a brilliance that left visitors awestruck. Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla vied for attention with their competing systems, and the fair became a proving ground for the new age of electric power. Machinery halls displayed the latest inventions: elevators, typewriters, telephones, and farm equipment. Manufacturers from across the country exhibited their goods, from sewing machines to automobiles, demonstrating the industrial might that had grown so rapidly since the Civil War. Cultural achievements stood alongside industrial ones. The fair hosted exhibits of art and architecture, music and literature, anthropology and natural history. Nations from around the world erected pavilions to display their own traditions and products, creating an international atmosphere that reflected America's growing role in global affairs. Chicago itself reveled in the opportunity, presenting the city as modern, cosmopolitan, and cultured. A far cry from the stockyards and smoke that defined its reputation in the popular press. Yet, for all its grandeur, the fair was not only about admiration, it was also about competition. New York had given the world the Statue of Liberty. Paris had dazzled with the Eiffel Tower at its exposition in 1889. Chicago needed something equally bold. and it founded in George Ferris's Great Wheel, a massive structure rising 264 feet into the air, capable of carrying more than 2,000 passengers at a time. The Ferris wheel was both an engineering marvel and a symbol of American ingenuity, proving that the Midwest could innovate as impressively as Europe's greatest capitals. Visitors lined up to ride, marveling at the panoramic view of the city and the lake from its top. For the millions who came, the fair was not only an exhibition, but an experience of wonder. Families wandered through exhibits of exotic animals and foreign villages, sampled new foods like Cracker Jack and juicy fruit gum, and watched the debut of products that would become everyday staples, from dishwashers to breakfast cereals. The fair offered Americans a glimpse of what modern life could be, filled with technology, convenience, and global connection. It was, in many ways, a dream of progress made tangible. But the White City also had a darker side, one that revealed the contrasts and contradictions of the Gilded Age. Just beyond its gates lay the real Chicago, a city where many immigrants lived in crowded tenements, where smoke from factories choked the air, and where laborers toiled for low wages in dangerous conditions. The fair presented an image of order, beauty, and harmony, but it was an illusion carefully constructed to mask the turmoil of urbanization. Labor unrest simmered even as the fair dazzled. Only a year before, Chicago had been rocked by the Haymarket Affair, and tensions between workers and employers remained raw. The Panic of 1893, one of the worst economic depressions in American history, struck just as the fair opened. Banks failed, railroads collapsed, and unemployment soared. While millions strolled through the White City, thousands of Chicagoans faced hunger and poverty outside its walls. The contrast between spectacle and struggle was stark, a reminder that industrial progress came at a human cost. The fair also reflected the racial and cultural prejudices of its time. While African American leaders petitioned for representation, their contributions were largely excluded from official exhibits. Instead, they were relegated to sideshows or ignored altogether. Native Americans were displayed in anthropological exhibits that portrayed them as relics of a vanishing race, rather than as living peoples with vibrant cultures. Foreign villages were presented in ways that reinforced stereotypes, serving more as entertainment than education. The White City celebrated progress, but it did so through the lens of white, middle-class America, leaving many voices unheard. Still, the fair left an indelible mark. It inspired a generation of architects and planners, sparking the City Beautiful movement that aimed to bring order, beauty, and civic pride to urban America. Its buildings may have been temporary, but its influence on architecture, particularly the rise of neoclassical design in courthouses, museums, and libraries, was lasting. The Ferris wheel became a symbol of amusement and engineering, copied in fairs and cities around the world. The fair also helped cement Chicago's status as a city of international stature, no longer just a center of industry, but a cultural and intellectual hub. When the fair closed in October 1893, fireworks lit the night sky, and speeches proclaimed the triumph of Chicago and of modern America. Yet even as the White City faded, dismantled, or left to decay, its legacy endured in memory and imagination. Visitors returned home with stories of marvels, of a city that had risen from ashes to rival the world's greatest, of a nation confident in its progress and its future. For Illinois, the world's Columbian Exposition was more than a fair. It was a declaration that from prairie soil and frontier hardship had grown a state capable of shaping not only its own destiny, but the destiny of a nation. It was a moment of pride, but also a reminder of the contradictions that lay beneath the surface. Wealth and poverty, innovation and exploitation, beauty and inequality. The White City shone brilliantly, but its shadows were long. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Illinois stood poised between promise and challenge. The fair had revealed the heights of progress that industry and imagination could achieve. But it had also hinted at the social struggles that would define the new century. In Chicago's streets, in its factories and neighborhoods, the battles over labor, immigration, and justice were only beginning. The White City had been a vision of harmony, but the real city beyond it would demand harder reckonings. Chapter 9. Prohibition, Gangsters, and Jazz. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, Chicago stood as a city rebuilt, celebrated, and transformed by the world's Columbian Exposition. It was a city of ambition and contradictions, and in the years that followed, those contradictions only deepened. By the 1920s, Chicago had become a stage upon which America's greatest hopes and darkest vices played out. It was the age of Prohibition, of speakeasies and jazz clubs, of gangsters who ruled with bullets and bribes, and of a city that seemed to embody both the promise of opportunity and the dangers of excess. The stage for the Roaring Twenties had been set by the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1919 and the Volstead Act that enforced it. Prohibition, the nationwide ban on the manufacture and sale of alcoholic beverages, was hailed by its supporters as a moral crusade that would end drunkenness, strengthen families, and uplift society. Yet in Chicago, it had the opposite effect. Rather than eliminating alcohol, it created a vast underground economy that flooded the city with liquor and transformed organized crime into an empire. Chicago's geography made it uniquely suited to become a bootlegging capital. With its proximity to Canada, where alcohol remained legal, and its access to railroads, lakes, and hidden routes through the countryside, liquor could be smuggled into the city with relative ease. From there, it flowed into thousands of speakeasies, hidden bars tucked behind storefronts, in basements, or disguised as clubs and restaurants. These establishments ranged from shabby backroom dives to glamorous nightclubs, where the city's elite rubbed shoulders with gangsters and entertainers. Into this world stepped Alphonse Gabriel Capone, a Brooklyn-born gangster who would become the most infamous name in Chicago's history. Capone arrived in the city in 1919, working first under crime boss Johnny Torrio. When Torrio retired after an assassination attempt, Capone took control of the empire. With a mix of charm, ruthlessness, and business acumen, he built a bootlegging operation that spanned breweries, distilleries, and distribution networks, generating millions of dollars each year. At his height, Capone controlled much of the illegal liquor trade in Chicago, along with gambling and prostitution. Capone's reign was marked by both violence and spectacle. Rival gangs fought bloody wars over territory, their battles spilling into the streets in drive-by shootings and bombings. The most notorious of these conflicts culminated in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of 1929, when 7 members of a rival gang were lined up against a wall and gunned down by men disguised as police officers. The brutality shocked the nation and cemented Capone's image as the ruthless king of Chicago crime. Yet to many Chicagoans, Capone was more than a gangster. He was a paradoxical figure who handed out free turkeys at Thanksgiving, attended baseball games, and cultivated an image of the tough but generous boss who looked after his city. Behind the glamour and notoriety lay corruption on a staggering scale. City officials, police officers, and judges were often on Capone's payroll, turning a blind eye to bootlegging operations and shielding his men from prosecution. Elections were influenced, raids were tipped off, and justice was bent by envelopes of cash. Chicago became synonymous with corruption, a place where the line between law and crime blurred, and where the rule of money often outweighed the rule of law. For reformers and moralists, the city became a cautionary tale of Prohibition's unintended consequences. But the Roaring Twenties in Chicago were not only about crime, they were also about culture. And nowhere was that culture more alive than in the city's jazz clubs. African Americans who had migrated from the South during the Great Migration brought with them new sounds and rhythms, and Chicago became a center of jazz innovation. On the South Side, in neighborhoods like Bronzeville, clubs such as the Sunset Cafe and the Dreamland Ballroom pulsed with music that drew crowds from every corner of the city. Musicians like Louis Armstrong, King Oliver, and Jelly Roll Morton played to packed houses, their improvisations and energy reshaping American music. Jazz clubs were more than places of entertainment. They were symbols of a changing America. In their smoky rooms, races and classes mingled in ways that defied the rigid segregation of the era. Politicians, businessmen, laborers, and gangsters all shared the same space, drawn by the lure of music and forbidden drink. The vitality of the scene gave Chicago a reputation as the jazz capital of the North, a cultural counterpoint to the violence that plagued its streets. The contradictions of the city in the 1920s were stark. On one hand, Chicago was a place of extraordinary opportunity. Immigrants continued to pour in from Europe, joined by African Americans from the South seeking work in the city's factories and stockyards. Jobs were plentiful, wages higher than in many other places, and the city's industries, meatpacking, steel, railroads, and manufacturing, continued to expand. For many families, Chicago offered a chance to climb the ladder of prosperity, to own a home, to educate their children, to be part of the modern world. On the other hand, the cost of that opportunity was high. Tenement housing in immigrant neighborhoods was overcrowded and unsanitary. Laborers faced dangerous conditions in factories and slaughterhouses. Racial tensions simmered, erupting into violence in 1919 when a race riot swept the city after the drowning of a black teenager who had drifted into a whites-only section of a beach. The riot left 38 people dead and hundreds injured, a grim reminder that Chicago's promise of opportunity was not shared equally. The city's political life reflected these contradictions as well. Mayors rose and fell on waves of reform and corruption. Anton Cermak, later assassinated in 1933, began building the democratic machine that would dominate Chicago politics for decades, stitching together a coalition of immigrants and working-class voters. Yet politics in the 1920s were still deeply intertwined with organized crime, and reformers struggled to root out the influence of gangs. Chicago's reputation as a city of opportunity was matched by its reputation as a city of excess, a place where fortunes and lives could be lost as easily as they were made. The glamour of the Roaring Twenties, with its jazz, flappers, and speakeasies, often masked the underlying fragility of the era. For Chicago, that fragility was clear. The violence of gang wars revealed the weakness of law enforcement and the corrosive power of corruption. The opulence of nightclubs stood in contrast to the poverty of tenements. The music of jazz carried joy and liberation, but it also underscored the struggles of communities seeking to carve out space in a segregated city. By the end of the decade, the excesses of the 1920s began to falter. The stock market crash of 1929 brought the economic boom to a halt, plunging the nation into the Great Depression. For Capone, once untouchable, the tide also turned. In 1931, he was convicted not of murder or bootlegging, but of tax evasion, sentenced to prison as federal authorities finally found a way to bring him down. His fall symbolized the collapse of the gangster empire that had flourished under Prohibition, even as the broader experiment of banning alcohol came to be seen as a failure. Yet the image of Chicago in the Roaring Twenties endured. Larger than life, full of energy and danger, opportunity and corruption. It was a city that embodied the spirit of the age, with its music, its gangsters, and its restless ambition. To many Americans, Chicago was the symbol of what the 20s meant, a nation surging with confidence and creativity, but also flirting with chaos and excess. Illinois, through Chicago, had become a mirror of America itself in the 1920s. It was a place of freedom and vice, of progress and inequality, of dazzling innovation and brutal violence. The decade left scars and legends alike, shaping the state's identity and cementing Chicago's place in history. When the jazz faded and the speakeasies closed, the memories of that wild era lingered, a reminder of the fragile line between opportunity and excess. Chapter 10. The Depression and War Years. The Roaring Twenties had left Chicago and Illinois glittering with energy and notoriety, but the crash of 1929 struck like a hammer. The stock market collapse shattered illusions of endless prosperity, and within months, the effects rippled across Illinois. Banks failed, factories closed, and the great city that had once been the symbol of opportunity became a place where bread lines stretched down blocks and men in worn coats clutched newspapers filled with stories of collapse. Farms, too, were caught in the storm. And across the prairie, families who had dreamed of stability found themselves teetering on the edge of ruin. The Depression hit Illinois with particular force because of its dual identity as both agricultural heartland and industrial hub. On the farms, falling crop prices devastated rural communities. Corn, wheat, and hogs fetched so little on the market that farmers sometimes burned grain for fuel because it was cheaper than coal. Many could not pay mortgages or taxes, and foreclosures became a common sight. Worse still, the 1930s brought drought to the Midwest. While Illinois was not at the very center of the Dust Bowl, the state felt its reach. Winds swept dust across the prairies, crops withered in the fields, and families from the Great Plains packed up and moved east. Some settling in Illinois towns, others pushing on toward Chicago in search of work. The sight of migrants with battered cars and weary children became part of the Depression landscape, adding to the burden of communities already struggling. In Chicago, the Depression transformed the city almost overnight. Unemployment soared as factories cut shifts or shut their doors entirely. Steel mills, stockyards, and rail yards, once roaring with activity, fell silent, leaving tens of thousands without wages. Families crowded into cold water flats, scraping together what they could from relief programs, soup kitchens, and the charity of neighbors. On State Street and Michigan Avenue, once proud symbols of commerce, stores faced empty windows and shrinking crowds. The jazz and glamour of the previous decade gave way to quiet desperation. Yet hardship also bred resistance. Chicago had long been a city of labor, and during the Depression, its working class became more militant. Strikes and protests erupted as workers demanded fair wages, relief, and better conditions. In 1937, tensions reached a boiling point at the Republic Steel Plant on the city's south side. Striking steelworkers, many of them immigrants or the sons of immigrants, clashed with police during what became known as the Memorial Day Massacre. 10 workers were killed, dozens more injured, when police opened fire on unarmed demonstrators. The event shocked the nation and symbolized the fierce struggles between labor and capital that defined the decade. For Illinois, it was a turning point that strengthened the labor movement, helping unions like the Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, gain footholds in industries once thought impenetrable. Politics during the Depression reflected both despair and hope. Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal brought federal relief to Illinois, funding public works projects that reshaped the state. Roads, schools, parks, and bridges were built by the hands of unemployed men hired by the Works Progress Administration and the Civilian Conservation Corps. In Chicago, relief programs provided jobs, food, and housing, though often amid bitter disputes over distribution and corruption. Mayor Edward Kelly, allied with the Democratic machine, wielded federal programs as tools of patronage, reinforcing Chicago's reputation for political maneuvering even in the midst of crisis. For many Illinoisans, however, the New Deal was a lifeline that kept hunger and despair at bay. The Depression also transformed demographics. African Americans, continuing the Great Migration from the South, moved into Chicago in greater numbers, seeking jobs and better lives. They filled neighborhoods like Bronzeville with vibrant culture, music, and community life, even as they faced discrimination and limited opportunities. The city's growing black population became a political force, increasingly courted by Democratic leaders who recognized their importance in elections. For immigrants from Europe, many of whom had come to Chicago in the early 20th century, the Depression deepened their struggles, but also solidified their roots, as families relied on tight-knit ethnic neighborhoods for survival. The city was becoming more diverse, more complex, and more divided along lines of class, race, and ethnicity. As the 1930s wore on, signs of recovery were slow and uneven. By the end of the decade, war clouds in Europe cast their shadow over Illinois, just as they did across the nation. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939 and war engulfed Europe, Illinois industries began to stir back to life. Contracts for weapons, vehicles, and machinery brought jobs back to factories, easing unemployment and preparing the state for what was to come. When the United States entered World War II, after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Illinois was ready to play a central role in the greatest mobilization in American history. Chicago became one of the engines of the war effort. Its factories shifted from producing consumer goods to turning out tanks, planes, guns, and ammunition. The city's stockyards, already massive, worked around the clock to process meat for soldiers overseas. Railroads carried raw materials in and finished products out, their lines humming with activity that recalled the city's Gilded Age boom. The Pullman Company produced rail cars and military equipment, while steel mills on the south side churned out the raw material for ships and armaments. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs once reserved for men, riveting aircraft, assembling radios, and proving indispensable to the war machine. Downstate Illinois also contributed, with towns like Peoria producing Caterpillar tractors that were converted into military machines, and factories in Rockford, Decatur, and Springfield, turning out parts and supplies. The agricultural might of Illinois fed armies abroad, with corn, soybeans, and livestock, providing essential food for soldiers and allies. Every corner of the state was touched by the war effort. From small towns organizing scrap drives and war bond sales to bustling cities that worked day and night. Illinois also sent its sons and daughters to fight. More than 900,000 Illinoisans served in the armed forces during World War II, a number that dwarfed the contributions of the Civil War generations. Soldiers from Illinois fought in North Africa, stormed the beaches of Normandy, marched through the Pacific Islands, and endured the Battle of the Bulge. Their letters home told of hardship and sacrifice, of longing for family and home, and of pride in serving their country. For many families, the war brought anxiety and loss, but also a sense of unity and shared purpose. The war years reshaped Illinois society. Women who had entered the workforce often found they did not wish to return to purely domestic roles, laying the groundwork for social changes in the decades to come. African Americans, who had migrated north in large numbers during the war, continued to push for civil rights, pointing to the contradiction of fighting for freedom abroad while facing discrimination at home. In Chicago, racial tensions remained high, but so too did the determination of Black leaders to demand equality and opportunity in the post-war world. Immigrant families too found new footing, their children serving in the military and their communities integrated into the broader story of America's fight against fascism. The war also deepened Illinois' role as a hub of science and innovation. At the University of Chicago, scientists working on the Manhattan Project achieved the first controlled nuclear chain reaction in 1942, a breakthrough that paved the way for the atomic bomb. Though cloaked in secrecy at the time, this event placed Illinois at the cutting edge of the scientific revolution that would shape the modern age. The war was fought not only with guns and planes, but with ideas and discoveries, and Illinois was at the forefront. By the time victory was declared in 1945, Illinois had been transformed. The Depression years had tested the resilience of its people, forcing them to endure poverty, strikes, and hunger. The war years had harnessed their strength, uniting factories, farms, and families in a common cause. Out of that crucible emerged a state more industrial, more urban, and more diverse than before. Chicago had reaffirmed its role as a city of global importance, a place whose factories and railroads had helped tip the balance of war. The prairies had proven once again their ability to feed not only a nation, but an army stretched across oceans. But the end of the war also marked the beginning of new questions. How would Illinois adjust to peace after years of total mobilization? What would happen to the women and minorities who had claimed new roles in wartime? How would labor, newly empowered by its wartime contributions, assert itself up in the post-war economy? These questions would shape the state's future as it entered the second half of the 20th century. For now, Illinoisans celebrated. Soldiers returned to parades, factories shifted back to consumer goods, and families reunited after years of absence. The scars of the Depression and war were deep, but they were matched by a sense of pride. Illinois had endured hardship, risen to the occasion, and proven itself once more at the heart of America's story. From the breadlines of the 1930s to the victory parades of the 1940s, the state had traveled a path of struggle and triumph, one that left it forever changed. Chapter 11: Civil Rights, Politics, and Protest. When World War II ended, Illinois emerged stronger, more industrialized, and more urban than ever before. Yet beneath the prosperity of the post-war boom lay deep divisions that would erupt in the decades that followed. Chicago, already the state's beating heart, became a stage for struggles that mirrored the nation's conscience. Civil rights, politics, and protest collided in its streets, shaping not only Illinois, but the country as a whole. The Great Migration that had begun during the war continued into the 1950s and 1960s. African Americans, leaving the Jim Crow South in search of jobs and dignity, poured into Chicago in waves. They settled primarily on the South Side in neighborhoods like Bronzeville, which became vibrant centers of culture and community. But the promise of opportunity was undercut by harsh realities. Segregation was not written into law in Illinois, but it was enforced by custom, policy, and prejudice. Restrictive covenants barred black families from buying homes in many neighborhoods. Banks denied them mortgages. Schools were overcrowded and underfunded. Jobs were available, but often the lowest paying and most dangerous. For many, Chicago became not a land of freedom, but another kind of battleground. The civil rights movement that was sweeping the South in the 1950s and 1960s soon took root in Chicago. Local leaders and organizations fought for fair housing, better schools, and equal treatment in jobs and public life. Demonstrations, marches, and boycotts became common, often met with resistance from city officials who preferred order to change. Into this volatile mix stepped Martin Luther King Jr. In 1966, King launched the Chicago Freedom Movement, his first major campaign in the North. He and his family moved into a rundown apartment on the West Side to experience firsthand the conditions endured by black Chicagoans. King's campaign targeted housing discrimination, demanding an end to practices that confined African Americans to slums while white families fled to the suburbs. Marches were organized into all-white neighborhoods such as Marquette Park and Cicero. The response was ferocious. Protesters were pelted with rocks, bottles, and hateful words. King himself was struck by a stone during one march, later remarking that he had never seen such hostility, even in the Deep South. The images shocked the nation, revealing that racism was not confined to Alabama or Mississippi, but was alive in the industrial North. Though the Chicago Freedom Movement did not achieve all of its goals, it left a profound impact. The campaign pressured the city to sign a fair housing agreement, and more importantly, it exposed the depth of segregation and inequality in northern cities. For Illinois, it was a wake-up call. The struggle for civil rights was not a distant issue, but a local one, fought on its own streets. At the same time, Chicago's politics were dominated by the towering figure of Mayor Richard J. Daley. Elected in 1955, Daley built one of the most powerful political machines in American history. From his base in Bridgeport, a working-class Irish neighborhood, Daley constructed a system that combined loyalty, patronage, and iron control. City jobs, contracts, and favors flowed to those who supported the democratic machine. In return, precinct captains delivered votes with clockwork precision. Daley's grip on Chicago was unmatched. He controlled not only City Hall, but also the Illinois Democratic Party, making him a kingmaker in state and national politics. Daley's machine was both admired and resented. Supporters praised him for keeping the city running, balancing budgets, and building infrastructure. Under his watch, expressways cut through neighborhoods. O'Hare Airport rose to prominence, and downtown Chicago gleamed with new skyscrapers. But critics condemned the machine for corruption, favoritism, and its resistance to reform. For African Americans, the machine was a mixed blessing. Daley courted black voters with promises of jobs and services. But his administration often ignored demands for real equality. His police force, loyal and heavily armed, became a symbol of order enforced at the expense of justice. The collision of civil rights activism and Daley's demand for order came to a head in 1968, a year of turmoil across the nation. The Vietnam War was raging, dividing Americans and fueling protests. In April, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, sparking riots in Chicago that left large sections of the West Side in flames. National Guard troops patrolled the streets, and the city bore the scars of both grief and anger. Later that summer, Chicago became the epicenter of national politics when it hosted the Democratic National Convention. The party, already fractured by the war, sought to nominate a candidate who could unite it. But outside the convention halls, thousands of demonstrators descended on Chicago to protest the Vietnam War and demand change. Youthful, passionate, and defiant, they filled Grant Park and the streets around the convention center. Mayor Daley was determined to maintain control. He deployed 12,000 police officers, supported by thousands of National Guard troops and federal soldiers. Barbed wire was strung around the convention site. As protesters clashed with police, chaos erupted. Nightsticks swung, tear gas filled the air, and television cameras broadcast the violence into living rooms across America. The chant of "The whole world is watching" rang out as demonstrators were beaten and arrested. Inside the convention hall, the scenes outside spilled in. Delegates clashed over the party's platform, while Daley himself shouted down dissenters, his face red with anger, his voice thundering. The Democratic Party was in disarray, its divisions exposed to the nation. For many Americans, the images of Chicago in 1968 symbolized the collapse of trust between citizens and institutions, between the people and their leaders. The events of that summer left lasting scars. Chicago's reputation was tarnished as a city of brutality and repression. Daley's machine, once untouchable, faced growing criticism from reformers and activists who demanded a more open and democratic politics. For Illinois, the convention was both a national spectacle and a local reckoning, a moment when the city's insistence on order collided with the era's demand for justice and freedom. The decades of civil rights, politics, and protest had transformed Illinois. The Great Migration had reshaped its demographics. Martin Luther King Jr.'s campaign had revealed its hidden wounds. The Democratic machine had wielded immense power but also provoked backlash. And the convention of 1968 had etched Chicago into the history of American dissent. Illinois was no longer simply the land of Lincoln. It was a stage where the great struggles of the 20th century played out in all their complexity. Race and power, war and protest, loyalty and rebellion. As the smoke cleared from 1968, the city and the state stood at a crossroads, uncertain of what would come next, but forever marked by the battles fought on their streets. Chapter 12. Modern Illinois. As the turbulence of the 1960s gave way to the decades that followed, Illinois stood at a crossroads. It was no longer the prairie frontier of its earliest days, nor the industrial powerhouse of the Gilded Age. Instead, it was a state divided between the farmlands that had long sustained it and the towering skyscrapers of Chicago that symbolized its global ambition. In the second half of the 20th century, Illinois came to embody both the promise and the struggles of modern America. Rising in sports and culture, plagued by corruption in politics, and wrestling with the shifting tides of its economy. Chicago was the engine, its skyline growing taller with each decade. The Sears Tower, completed in 1973, soared more than 1,400 feet into the air, becoming the tallest building in the world and a monument to Illinois' enduring ambition. Its steel frame and sleek design reflected the state's place at the forefront of modern architecture, a tradition rooted in the rebuilding after the Great Fire and sharpened through the innovations of the 20th century. From the Loop to Lakeshore Drive, Chicago's skyscrapers became symbols of commerce and confidence, their glass facades glittering with the promise of progress. Yet beyond the skyline, Illinois was changing in ways that were not always so glamorous. The decline of manufacturing struck the state with the same force that hit other parts of the industrial Midwest. Steel mills on Chicago's South Side that had once roared with the sound of furnaces began to close. The stockyards, which had been the beating heart of the city's economy for a century, shut down in 1971, their legacy reduced to memory and museum exhibits. Factories in Rockford, Peoria, and Decatur cut jobs or moved production overseas. For thousands of workers, the security of industrial employment disappeared, leaving families and towns to struggle with unemployment, poverty, and uncertainty. In downstate Illinois, agriculture remained central, but it too faced challenges. Mechanization and corporate farming reduced the need for labor, while fluctuating commodity prices made life unpredictable for small farmers. Rural communities shrank as young people left for cities, chasing jobs and opportunities. Illinois was still the land of Lincoln, still a place of fields and rivers, but its identity was increasingly tied to urban life, especially to Chicago, which seemed to dominate not only the state's economy, but its politics and culture. Politics in Illinois carried forward a tradition as rich and troubled as the soil of the prairies. Corruption, long woven into the fabric of Chicago's machine politics, became a defining feature of the state's modern history. Governors and mayors alike found themselves entangled in scandals. Some, like Governor Otto Kerner in the 1970s, were convicted of bribery and corruption, tarnishing the image of leadership at the highest levels. Later governors, from George Ryan to Rod Blagojevich, would continue this unfortunate tradition, reinforcing Illinois' reputation as a state where politics was often indistinguishable from scandal. Chicago's City Hall, too, remained a place where deals were cut in back rooms and where loyalty was rewarded with contracts and jobs. For Illinoisans, political corruption became both a source of frustration and a kind of dark humor, a reminder that in their state, power often came with a price. But if politics weighed heavily, sports lifted spirits. In the 1980s and 1990s, Illinois, and particularly Chicago, found itself at the center of a global phenomenon: the rise of Michael Jordan and the Chicago Bulls. Jordan arrived in the NBA in 1984, a young man from North Carolina with extraordinary talent and determination. Over the next 2 decades, he would transform not only basketball, but the very identity of Chicago. His acrobatic dunks, relentless drive, and uncanny ability to dominate games made him a legend. With teammates like Scottie Pippen and under the guidance of coach Phil Jackson, Jordan led the Bulls to 6 NBA championships in the 1990s. The United Center, nicknamed the house that Jordan built, became a temple of modern sport, filled with fans who saw in Jordan not just an athlete, but an icon of excellence. The Bulls' dominance coincided with Chicago's effort to rebrand itself as a city of culture and sophistication. The city hosted major events, expanded its museums, and promoted its theater and music scenes. The rise of Jordan gave Chicago a global spotlight, and for many, he became the face of Illinois itself. Confident, powerful, and impossible to ignore. His number 23 jersey was worn not only in Chicago's neighborhoods, but on playgrounds and courts around the world. Jordan embodied the possibility of greatness, a counterbalance to the stories of corruption and decline that often filled the news. Culture thrived in other ways as well. Chicago's blues and jazz traditions continued to flourish, drawing musicians and audiences from around the world. The city's neighborhoods, shaped by waves of immigration, gave it a rich diversity. Polish, Mexican, Puerto Rican, and other communities expanded, each adding their traditions to the tapestry of Illinois life. The food of Chicago, from deep dish pizza to hot dogs dragged through the garden, became symbols of the city's identity, mixing high culture with working-class roots. Festivals celebrated ethnicity, music, and art, keeping alive the sense of Chicago as a city that welcomed the world, even as it sometimes struggled with division. Those divisions were real and often painful. Racial inequality, highlighted during the civil rights struggles of the 1960s, persisted in the decades that followed. Chicago remained one of the most segregated cities in America, with African Americans concentrated in specific neighborhoods, often cut off from resources and opportunity. Schools were divided, crime plagued some areas, and poverty lingered in communities left behind by the decline of industry. Political promises of renewal and reform often fell short, leaving frustration to build. At the same time, waves of Latino immigrants reshaped the city, bringing new energy but also facing barriers. The mosaic of Chicago grew more diverse, but it also revealed the challenges of building unity in a time of economic change and social strain. Illinois politics mirrored this complexity. Mayor Richard J. Daley's death in 1976 ended an era, but the machine he built continued under his successors. His son, Richard M. Daley, would become one of Chicago's longest-serving mayors, overseeing a city that sought to modernize even as it wrestled with old problems. Under his tenure, the city expanded parks, improved infrastructure, and cultivated an image of renewal. Millennium Park, with its iconic Cloud Gate sculpture, became a symbol of a new Chicago, marrying art and architecture in a public space that attracted millions. Yet critics pointed to the persistence of corruption, inequality, and mismanagement, proof that the old habits of Illinois politics were not easily erased. For the rest of the state, the dominance of Chicago sometimes bred resentment. Downstate Illinois, with its farms and smaller cities, often felt overshadowed by the metropolis on the lake. Political debates over taxes, schools, and services reflected this tension, as rural and suburban voters bristled at the weight of Chicago's influence. The divide between Chicagoland and downstate became a defining feature of Illinois politics, shaping elections and policy decisions. By the end of the 20th century, Illinois had become a microcosm of America's struggles and successes. It was a state of towering ambition and deep flaws, of farmland that still fed the world and skyscrapers that reached for the heavens. It was a place where political corruption seemed never to vanish, yet where cultural and athletic triumphs inspired millions. The decline of manufacturing left scars, but the rise of service industries, finance, and technology offered new paths forward. For Illinoisans, the late 20th century was a time of contradiction. They could cheer Michael Jordan leading the Bulls to another championship while reading headlines about governors indicted for corruption. They could marvel at the Sears Tower piercing the clouds while watching factories close and communities shrink. They could celebrate the diversity of Chicago's neighborhoods while reckoning with the persistence of inequality. Illinois was both promise and struggle, farmland and skyscraper, a place that embodied the complexity of modern America. The story of Illinois had always been one of transformation, from mounds and villages to French forts, from frontier cabins to industrial might. By the end of the 20th century, that story was still unfolding. But the state had firmly established itself as both a symbol of the nation's challenges and a beacon of its possibilities. As a new century dawned, Illinois carried forward its legacy of ambition and contradiction, ready to face the uncertainties of the future. Chapter 13. Illinois Today and Tomorrow. As Illinois stepped into the 21st century, it carried with it the weight of its past, the grandeur of Chicago's skyline, the legacy of Lincoln and industry, the scars of corruption, and the restless energy of a people always striving to build something more. Yet today, the state is a place of contradictions as much as promise. It is farmland and skyscraper, rust belt and silicon prairie, a symbol of opportunity and a cautionary tale of struggle. To understand Illinois today is to glimpse America in miniature, its divisions, its dreams, and its fight for renewal. Politics remains one of the defining features of Illinois, and often one of its greatest challenges. The state's reputation for corruption has persisted stubbornly into the modern era, with multiple governors convicted of crimes in recent decades. Rod Blagojevich's downfall in 2009, after he was caught attempting to sell Barack Obama's vacated Senate seat, became a spectacle that once again placed Illinois politics under the harsh national spotlight. His conviction followed a long line of scandals, reinforcing the cynical joke that in Illinois, governors either move to higher office or to prison. Yet the endurance of the political machine, even in altered form, is only part of the story. Illinois politics also reflect the deep divide between its urban north and its rural south, between Chicago and the vast stretches of farmland that feel worlds apart. In elections, Chicago's overwhelming Democratic majority often clashes with the Republican lean of downstate counties, creating a political map split starkly along geographic lines. These divisions mirror the polarization of the nation, with Illinois standing as a battleground between progressive ambitions and conservative resistance. Economically, Illinois has faced profound shifts. The decline of manufacturing that began in the late 20th century has continued, leaving scars in communities once built around steel, auto parts, or heavy machinery. Factories in Rockford, Decatur, and East St. Louis have closed, hollowing out local economies. Yet at the same time, new industries have emerged. Chicago has positioned itself as a hub for finance, healthcare, education, and logistics. Its O'Hare Airport one of the busiest in the world. Its trading floors still buzzing with global commerce. The city has also become a center for technology and innovation, with startups and tech firms clustering in districts like the Fulton Market, and universities like Northwestern and the University of Chicago feeding talent into the economy. Downstate, agriculture has modernized, with Illinois remaining one of the nation's leading producers of corn and soybeans. Though the scale and mechanization of farming have left fewer people working the land. The shift from industry to information, from manufacturing to service and technology, has left Illinois both enriched and divided, with prosperity concentrated in some places and decline in others. Crime and reform, particularly in Chicago, continue to shape Illinois' identity. Chicago has long battled with violence, especially gun violence, which has plagued neighborhoods on the city's south and west sides. Headlines of shootings and homicides dominate the news, feeding national narratives of Chicago as a city out of control. For residents, the reality is more complex. Many neighborhoods thrive in safety and prosperity, while others endure cycles of poverty, disinvestment, and violence. Efforts at reform, through community programs, policing changes, and investment in schools and jobs, have been ongoing but uneven. Activists demand accountability from police, pointing to cases of misconduct that have eroded trust, while city officials struggle to balance calls for reform with the urgent need to stem violence. The debates unfolding in Chicago echo those across America, making the city both a symbol of urban struggle and a laboratory for change. At the same time, Illinois is pushing toward a future shaped by renewable energy and technology. The state has set ambitious goals for clean energy, investing in wind farms that dot its prairies and solar fields that stretch across rural counties. With its flat landscapes and open spaces, Illinois has become one of the nation's leaders in wind energy production. While Chicago pursues sustainability initiatives aimed at reducing emissions and modernizing infrastructure, universities and research centers drive innovation in renewable technology, while startups experiment with ways to harness the power of the state's geography and resources. For a state that once relied on coal and industry, the shift toward clean energy represents not just environmental responsibility, but economic opportunity, offering a chance to reinvent itself for a new century. Culturally, Illinois remains a powerhouse. Chicago's art scene, from its theaters to its museums to its music venues, continues to draw visitors and acclaim. The city's food culture thrives, with Michelin-starred restaurants sharing the stage with neighborhood staples that embody its immigrant heritage. Sports remains central to identity, with the legacy of Michael Jordan carried forward by new generations of athletes and teams. The Cubs' World Series victory in 2016 ended a century-long drought, uniting the city in joy and reminding Illinoisans of their enduring capacity for hope. Festivals, parades, and community celebrations reflect the diversity of the state's people. From Polish to Mexican, African American to South Asian, each adding to the tapestry of Illinois life. Demographically, the state continues to change. Immigrants from Latin America, Asia, and Africa have reshaped neighborhoods, schools, and economies. Suburbs around Chicago have grown increasingly diverse, reflecting broader trends in America. At the same time, some downstate communities face population decline as younger residents move to urban centers or out of state entirely. Illinois has wrestled with outmigration, with many families leaving in search of lower taxes, cheaper housing, or new opportunities elsewhere. This population shift has fueled political debates and raised questions about the state's long-term economic health. Illinois has also been at the center of national politics. Barack Obama's rise from state senator to U.S. senator to President of the United States placed Illinois once again in the spotlight as the land of political leaders who could capture the nation's imagination. Obama's election in 2008 brought pride to many Illinoisans, linking the state to a legacy of leadership that stretched back to Abraham Lincoln. Yet, even as Illinois produced presidents, it also produced scandals, a reminder of its dual identity as a cradle of greatness and a breeding ground for corruption. Looking at Illinois today, one sees a state grappling with the same forces that shape America itself. Its political divisions, stark between city and countryside, reflect the national polarization, Its economic transformation, from manufacturing to technology, mirrors the broader shift of the American economy. Its struggles with crime, inequality, and reform are those of every major city in the nation. And its push toward renewable energy and innovation speaks to the challenges and opportunities of a world facing climate change and globalization. Illinois is, in many ways, the country in miniature. Its triumphs and troubles magnified in the streets of Chicago, the fields of the Prairie, and the halls of its capital in Springfield. What lies ahead for Illinois is uncertain, as it has always been. The state faces daunting challenges, balancing budgets weighed down by pension obligations, addressing violence in its neighborhoods, bridging divides between Chicago and downstate, and ensuring that prosperity reaches beyond the glittering towers of the Loop. Yet it also carries immense potential. The ingenuity of its people, the power of its institutions, the richness of its culture, and the resilience that has carried it through fires, depressions, wars, and upheavals. Illinois today is a place of contrasts, but also of continuity. From the mounds of Cahokia to the skyscrapers of Chicago, from the fields of corn to the laboratories of cutting-edge science, it has always been a state in motion, reinventing itself with each new era. As it looks toward tomorrow, Illinois remains a microcosm of America's story. Divided yet striving, scarred yet hopeful. A land forever caught between its past and its promise. Epilogue. The Prairie State's Legacy. Illinois is a land of contradictions, and perhaps that is what makes its story so powerfully American. From its earliest days, long before the word Illinois was ever spoken, this land was alive with cultures that thrived, built, traded, and dreamed. Cahokia's great mound stood as a testament to human ingenuity, and the Illinois tribes carried forward traditions that connected people to land and river. Yet even as those ancient civilizations faded, new forces arrived, layering fresh struggles, hopes, and failures onto an already rich soil. The French came with their missionaries and fur traders, imagining Illinois as a frontier of New France. Their dreams of empire gave way to British control, and soon after, to the young United States. George Rogers Clark marched through these prairies and rivers, reminding the world that Illinois was not some forgotten wilderness, but a prize worth seizing. Out of those turbulent colonial days, the statehood of 1818 emerged, a promise of inclusion, but also a frontier of uncertainty. The settlers who carved their lives from prairie sod carried dreams as vast as the horizons that stretched before them. Springfield rose as a hub of politics and culture, its most famous son, Abraham Lincoln, destined to shape the entire nation. But Illinois, like Lincoln himself, bore deep contradictions. It was a free state with neighbors and citizens who still yearned for slavery's profits. It was a land that nurtured the Underground Railroad, even as it wrestled with laws designed to keep black families from settling freely. Out of this tension came the Lincoln-Douglas debates, where questions of freedom and equality turned Illinois into the stage for the most profound moral crisis in America's history. The Civil War tested the Union, and Illinois rose with force and determination. Its railroads, factories, and regiments of young men carried the fight to preserve the nation. Lincoln, from the heart of Illinois, became not just the great emancipator, but the symbol of what the state itself represented. A place where ideals and realities clashed, often painfully, but still pointed toward something greater. When peace returned, Illinois did not rest. It exploded into the modern age, with Chicago at its center. The canal and the rails made the city the beating heart of America's commerce. Then came the Great Fire, which reduced much of that dream to ash, only for the city to rebuild taller, stronger, and more ambitious than before. Immigrants from every corner of the earth poured in, filling the factories and neighborhoods with energy, but also with conflict. Out of these struggles grew both the soaring skyscrapers of the Loop and the cries of laborers demanding justice. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 placed Illinois on the global stage, dazzling the world with electric lights, cultural spectacles, and visions of the future. Yet even in those shining white city walls, shadows lingered. Poverty, crime, and the inequality that industrialization had magnified. Those shadows deepened in the Prohibition era, when Al Capone's empire made Chicago infamous as much for its corruption as for its culture. Jazz, liquor, and gangland violence defined the era, showing once again Illinois' strange ability to be both the cradle of innovation and the emblem of excess. The Depression and war years reminded Illinois of its resilience. Farmers felt the sting of dust and drought. Workers filled factories with strikes and solidarity, and young men shipped off to foreign battlefields. In World War II, Illinois became an arsenal of democracy, forging steel, planes, and ships that turned the tide of war. Afterward, the state wrestled with new identities in an age of civil rights and protest. Martin Luther King Jr. walked Chicago's streets to demand justice, and the Democratic National Convention of 1968 erupted in violence that mirrored the fractures of an entire generation. The political machine of Mayor Daley stood as both a symbol of stability and a sign of suffocating control. In the late 20th century, Illinois both soared and stumbled. The Bulls, with Michael Jordan at their helm, lifted Chicago's spirit to heights never seen before, even as factories closed and working-class families struggled. Corruption scandals toppled governors and officials, tarnishing the state's image. Yet innovation continued in science, medicine, and technology. Rural Illinois, with its cornfields and small towns, often seemed worlds apart from the skyscrapers of Chicago, but both belonged to the same story. Today, Illinois is again at a crossroads. Chicago continues to wrestle with crime and inequality, even as it leads the way in finance, culture, and technology. Wind turbines rise over prairie landscapes, a sign that the state is looking toward renewable energy and a new future. Political divisions run deep, as they do across the nation, but Illinois has always been a mirror for America's struggles. Immigration, industry, freedom, corruption, protest, and progress. All these forces that shape the United States can be found here, distilled into one state's journey. Illinois is called the land of Lincoln, and rightly so. Lincoln's legacy of honesty, sacrifice, and vision still echoes across its plains and its politics. But the state is more than one man's shadow. It is a lens into the contradictions of the American experiment. It is freedom and oppression, wealth and poverty, hope and despair, all colliding on the same soil. Its cities and its farms, its immigrants and its natives, its triumphs and its tragedies, all belong to a legacy that is uniquely Illinois and unmistakably American. To tell the story of Illinois is to tell the story of America itself, in all its brilliance and in all its flaws. It is a state that refuses to be one thing, because it has always been many things. It is both prairie and metropolis, both cradle of democracy and theater of corruption. Its contradictions are not weaknesses, but reflections of the messy ambitious, unrelenting character of the nation. And so, the legacy of Illinois remains not just in its history books, monuments, or slogans, but in the ongoing story of a state that continues to define and be defined by the promise and peril of America.